Welcome again to Off the Page. My guest today teaches creative writing at the University of Victoria. Oh, he's won a Governor General's Award. He's written some novels, books of short stories, and he comes from British Columbia. I welcome Jack Hodgins.
Thank you.
Good to have you here in the East.
It's good to be here. It's been a few years since I've been in Halifax. Nice to be back.
What is this passion for narrative that you've written about?
Well, it's a book about the process of writing fiction. Came out of my classes. Actually, I resisted writing this book.
It's a kind of a how-to book.
It's sort of a how-to book, but tries not to sound like a how-to book. I deliberately set out to make sure I didn't sound as if I knew all the answers, because I knew that would be trouble. I wanted to just explore the different ways that writers have solved certain problems that come up for writing fiction. It actually grew out of my own teaching. I got so fed up with running off all the handouts that I felt were necessary with every class that at some point I thought I should, just run them all off at one time, have them printed up, and then I won't have to think about it again. And I did that, and my editor got wind of them and had a look and said, I want to publish this.
But the title itself, The Passion, what is that passion?
The passion is...
You're stuck with it?
Yeah, I think the passion is, and we recognize it in one another and in others, the desire to write and tell stories that is stronger than almost anything else, the thing that makes it irresistible, that I think is necessary.
How did you become inflicted with this particular passion? Way back when you were a little kid?
Way back when I was a little kid. I suspect I wanted to write very soon after I learned to read. That for me, books were magic from the very beginning, and I wanted to be one of the people that put the magic between the covers. And so when I was a kid, I was writing stories. Even if I would go to a Saturday afternoon movie, and then I'd go home and write it up as a story with pictures.
Borrowing from the
borrowing,
movie
yeah.
What's a plot of a Jack Hodgins 10-year-old story or something
So,
when you were 10?
Well, there would have to be
horses
and guns and beautiful redheads with smoking pistols. I remember my first published book. I don't know what age I was, but I was young enough to have a babysitter. And I wrote the story and asked her to type it up for me. I asked the babysitter to type it up, and she did, and then I drew pictures, made a cover, stitched it together, put a cover with, in this case, a beautiful redhead with a smoking pistol. And that was my first book.
Wow.
I don't know what happened in it. I can't remember.
Do you still have a copy of it somewhere?
I don't think so.
The babysitter stole it or something maybe?
The National Library's got most of my early rejections and failed novels and everything, but I don't think they go back that far.
Oh, it's too bad. You're from Vancouver Island. This is a place of large things, big waves in the sea, mountains, trees. Is there something about the spirit of that particular place that shapes your writing?
I'm sure there is, but I'm probably the last person to know what it is because I grew up there. It's just natural. It's the air I breathe. It has something to do with the colors. It has something to do with the dimensions, the huge mountains and the trees. And I remember the first time I was ever on the Canadian prairies, I felt I wanted to throw myself on the ground and hold on because I was the tallest thing around, and I felt very insecure. And I realized when I got home, I really feel I'm snuggling up to the trees and the mountains. I feel safer there.
You're dwarfed by all that monumental landscape.
Yes, you're just another little ant wandering around beneath the gigantic trees.
If someone writes a novel, do you become a little bit larger than yourself?
I think you probably become not only larger, but multiple. One of the joys of writing fiction, of course, is that you get to be lots of other people besides yourself. And I was always sorry that I had to be only one person all my life.
It is kind of disappointing, isn't
it? It is disappointing.
Yeah.
You have to be you. And I think being a fiction writer, perhaps being an actor would be similar. You get to be other people for a while. You can put yourself in other people's shoes. You can imagine what it's like to be them. You can presume things about what's going on in their heads. For a little while, you can be an airplane pilot or an expert dynamite blaster or whatever you want.
Does anybody ever say, what's the matter, Jack? You can't just be satisfied to be yourself?
Nobody's ever said that to me. Anybody who knows me knows, no, I want to be lots of people.
Yeah, that's a great privilege, isn't it? Being a writer of fiction, that you get to live all those other lives. Is it better than real life? Not
necessarily. Well, no. Maybe it is an adjunct to real life. Probably for it to work, it's necessary for the real you, whoever that is, to be pretty centered and to well, you wouldn't want to feel that you were going to go off and be somebody else and not get back to where you started.
Yes.
I think you need to
would be uncomfortable.
Yeah, you need to feel that you need to have a good sense of who you are in order to have confidence to step into somebody else's shoes.
That's a good point. Yeah, I could see another writer perhaps getting lost in a novel and liking it so much perhaps, or finding that life so much more interesting that you don't want to come back.
You don't want to come back.
But readers feel that way sometimes. I do. If I'm reading a good novel, there's a good novel came across my desk the other day called Broken Ground, written by a guy named Jack Hodgins. It's set in 1922 in North Vancouver Island, a place you're familiar with, but I don't think you were around in 1922, were you?
No, I wasn't, but everybody I grew up with seemed to be. This was a returned soldier settlement after the First World War, and my parents, separately as children, moved into that community just before 22. And they, as children, experienced the great forest fire that came down out of the mountains and went right through the community just about the time that the returned soldiers had finished building their houses. And I spent my whole childhood, in fact, I guess I've spent my whole life listening to those people talk about the Great Fire of 22. And I suspect that I felt cheated out of a great adventure that happened before I got around to be part of it. And I think I've known for a long time I wanted to write about it.
More about the fire, they're more affected by the fire than by World War I itself?
That's the astonishing thing.
Yeah.
Apparently nobody ever talked about the war. Oh. And I talked to a lot of their children, their surviving children, and almost all of them said, no, my dad or my mother never talked about the war. But they never stopped talking about the fire. And one of the things I wanted to do while I was writing this novel was see if I could discover why. And I think it has something to do with a lack of vocabulary for talking about the war. For instance, I read in a book of first-person accounts, one fellow saying, my mother was shocked and horrified when I told her that I'd had to sleep in a barn. And the implication is, how could she handle it if I ever found a way of telling her what I really went through? Wow. So they just shut up. They didn't talk about it. But, and I have the feeling that these were all strangers who came together. They didn't know each other before the war. Some of them may have known each other during the war. And here they were all thrown in the same community, thanks to the government, told to make farms out of these stump pastures. And the fire was something they'd all experienced together. So they didn't need a special vocabulary. They only needed to be able to say, remembered the time, yes. Or too bad that Clifford boy got burned, things like that. And then off they'd go, and everybody else could tell a little bit.
You know, these soldiers, they're coming back from World War I, all the horrors of that event. Is it true that the Canadian military was shooting deserters during World War I?
Yes, it was. This was a British tradition, or at least it was a British dictate.
And what was the idea? You know, everybody else says, oh, well, I better not do that because look what happens.
It was supposed to be for discipline purpose. Yeah. You know, you scare everybody else. I mean, if you're afraid to go over the top and across no man's land with people shooting at you, well, then just remember there's somebody behind you who is prepared to shoot you for refusing. And so deserters and cowards, however they define that, I don't know, but those were two of the terms. I think there was a third, which I can't remember, were court-martialed. And 25 Canadians were sentenced to the death penalty, and they were shot on sight by their fellow soldiers.
Sounds cruel and unfair by modern standards. We think of any war as being a very inhuman situation where people are likely to crack.
And this just makes it that much worse. To start with, they were volunteers. They were there because they'd chosen to go. And in many cases, the more I read about it, the more shocking some of it was. In many cases, the fellow who was shot had suffered sort of like a nervous breakdown, or suddenly got confused and wandered off in the wrong direction. But justice was very swift.
One of
in
those
days.
sad legacies of our history.
Interestingly, the Australians refused to do this because their army too was a volunteer army. It seemed inconsistent to them that somebody should be shot. I mean, punishment perhaps for deserting your fellow soldiers, but to be shot seemed a bit extreme.
Extreme. When the soldiers who survived the war came back, like the ones you write about, who returned to BC or go out there, they're given land by the government.
Yes.
Kind of reward.
That's their reward.
But it's not exactly the greatest farmland
No.
going, is it?
No. It turned out that Ottawa did most of the land grants for the returned soldiers. But they apparently turned down this one particular one that I grew up in, and that was the BC provincial government that got excited about it. They sent somebody up to test the soil who I swear must have been either drunk or inappropriately trained, and the minister, I think of agriculture, got very excited about this whole prospect. He wanted the soldiers to live decent lives and wanted them to give them something to welcome them home. I don't think he ever went up to look at what he was giving them.
It had been logged already, the land?
It had been logged already.
So the trees are cut down, you have a good start.
But the thing is, in those days when loggers logged, they left stumps that were 10 or 12 feet high. Because they were cutting trees down with hand saws, they had to get above the pitch. And the pitch would often go up the first 10 or 12 feet of a stump.
So these stumps were 12 feet high?
So these stumps are 10 or 12 feet high.
And how big in diameter?
They could be 6 feet or 10 feet or 12 feet across the bottom. A lot of them were still around when I was a kid. And by this time they had been gutted, rotted. And of course they were also black from the fire. We used to use them for castles and fortresses and all kinds of things. You could actually get in and make a room. You could drag furniture inside them.
Sounds surreal.
It was
amazing kind of situation.
But these farmers had to try and get rid of it.
How did you get rid of them? How did they get rid of them?
Blasting, dynamite.
Oh, back to war.
Back to war. Every day, well, not every day, but to clear another field meant getting rid of a whole bunch of stumps. And you had to dig under the roots and put in 120, 200 sticks of dynamite, light it, and run for your life.
Injuries, deaths?
There were injuries. There were not any deaths that I know about. I quizzed my dad a lot about this. When I was helping my parents move from the farm, they actually lived for 50 years on one of these farms. When they moved into town, I helped them move, and I came across a blaster's handbook from way back. And I read it, and I was fascinated by it. I thought, well, I love novels where you can actually learn how to do things you don't know how to do. You read Faulkner, you know how to look after a horse or how to feed cows and all that kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be interesting if you could actually learn how to blow up stumps from a novel? So I studied it very carefully, and I wrote the opening chapter where a boy's father blows up a stump. And then I went back to talk to my dad again, and I knew I wanted to have an expert ride into the community who could blast stumps better than anybody else. But what would I know about this? So I said to my dad, if somebody was a better blaster than anybody else, how would you know it? And he said, oh, that's easy. Most of us, when we blast stumps, we try to do it in such a way that you'll crack them in 4 equal quarters, and that makes it easier to drag them by horse or tractor out of the ground, so you can put them over in the corner of the field and burn them. But a really good blaster, he said, when the stump blasts, when it blows up, there's no shower of dirt or rocks. You'd never know anything was happening. There'd just be like a big burp. It splits into 4 perfect sections, but all 4 of them fold out like the opening up of a 4-petal flower.
Certain kind of explosive beauty there,
It's
I suppose.
an explosive beauty. A work of art.
A work of art.
So back to the drawing board I went and put that in somewhere in a later chapter.
I guess, yeah. So at home, if you too would like to learn how to blow up stumps, you might read Jack Hodgins' recent novel called Broken Ground. He's my guest today on Off the Page. We're going to take a short break and be right back after this.
This series is brought to you as a public service by Mount St. Vincent University.
Hi, we're back with Off the Page. My guest today is Jack Hodgins, and we're talking about all kinds of things. Vancouver Island, a new novel called Broken Ground. Now, when I read a Jack Hodgins novel, I see that there's deep and dark, mysterious things happening there. It's very serious literature, and then I flip the page and I find myself laughing. You've allowed yourself that license of being a serious Canadian writer who also builds humor into a story. Why do you do that?
I don't think it's anything I really think too much about. I find life humorous. I find that most people I know laugh quite a bit. Life does deliver us a lot of things that can be laughed about. And it seemed to me that it would be a dishonest novel, especially about the kind of people I know, that didn't have any humor in it. I don't think of it as comic.
No.
So much as just humor. The humor comes, I hope, from the characters, and also the way the characters see one another as humorous.
Well, as I read, many novels, I do find that they fall into two categories of novels that take themselves far too seriously, with almost no element of humor, and others that allow you to laugh with the author and that sort of thing. I do think there's a psychological difference there. Have you ever been kind of up against the wall where someone said you shouldn't be funny in the midst of writing something serious?
No, I haven't, although I have long had a sense that Canadians don't really take humorous writing quite as seriously as they take serious writing.
That's right.
And as if somehow that's a lesser kind of fiction. But to me, it's just a natural part of life. I was aware in writing Broken Ground that I was dealing with material that could have led me into quite a dark novel. I was dealing with 2 or 3 things that you might say are unthinkable. The things that I just as soon not think about, I forced myself to think about to work my way through in this novel. But because I was working with people I felt I understood and liked and enjoyed, it seemed natural that they joked with one another, that they found life amusing even in the midst of tragedy, or at least before tragedy and long after tragedy. And I think it's also it's good for the novel if the reader who is going through some of this cathartic tragedy has a few times when they can breathe and relax and smile at least, if not laugh.
It's a novel about the reconstruction of shattered lives, which has to make a good story in many ways. And do you do that all from observation and from history and from books or things like that, or do you reach down somewhere inside and find a fragment of shattered self to build into the novel?
I think it has to be all of those things. I think first I have to understand what all those other people have gone through and are going through. I think I then have to understand myself well enough to know how I relate to this material, how I would behave in those circumstances, and to enable my imagination to handle the things that I'm handling here. An Australian novelist friend of mine named Roger MacDonald that I traveled quite extensively with in Australia, and over the campfire we talked about writing fiction day after day. He drew to my attention something that I knew instinctively, but which I was glad to hear him say, that you can't really do a good job of a novel, no matter how long you work on it, until something in you clicks emotionally with something in the novel. It might be a person you identify with, or it might be an experience that is so close to one you've had that you know exactly how you'd feel. But there needs to be that moment when you enter the novel in disguise.
Remember the old cliche about being an artist or a writer? You've got to suffer if you want to be a good one.
Yeah.
You write about people who suffer. Have you suffered in your life to be a writer?
I think I've probably, by most standards, led a fairly privileged life. But that doesn't, suffering, I suppose, in the sense of the normal agonies of regret or longing or wishing you were somewhere else or whatever. I think, for instance, if a writer can remember being bullied in a schoolyard, and he has a good imagination, or she has a good imagination, that's enough to be able to write what it would be like to be in front of a firing squad. You take a small kernel of emotion and you can imagine it.
Yes.
Based upon that.
Well, lots of things from school and early childhood feels like firing squads.
Yes,
can project.
almost all of
it's
it.
just as real. It is. My first introduction into Hodgins' country, into your work, was The Invention of the World. That's the title, The Invention of the World. And I kept thinking, gosh, why didn't I have a chance to use that for a title for a book? You know, it's one of those titles that I was jealous of. I liked it a lot. It's a large, eccentric, ambitious novel. You like eccentric, don't you? Is that the world you come from? Is everybody in Vancouver Island, rural Vancouver Island, an eccentric?
Well, I don't think of them eccentric. I just think them as slightly extravagant, a lot of them. It's probably a combination of the numbers of people who are eccentric or extravagant and my own interest in those who sort of stand out slightly above the crowd. But the interesting thing is that if you look closely enough, everybody is eccentric or
Sure.
extravagant in some way. Everyone is worthy of a great novel. Everybody's story is worth telling, but some you have to look a little more closely. The wild eccentrics sometimes are easier to write about, although you have to work a little harder to understand them. The danger in writing about eccentrics, if you see them as eccentrics, is you might be satisfied with the surfaces. And I think a novelist needs to go behind that.
That's right. You get caught up in a quirky guy who lives in a treehouse and collects hubcaps.
That's right.
And miss the heart.
Yeah.
You teach creative writing too, as I was mentioning. Can you teach a person to be creative?
That's the dreaded question. What you can do is help people, guide people a little bit to being a better writer than when they started. To take them from where they are and move them along a little, to let them take advantage of your experience, and not have to make all the mistakes that you made. To push, prod, edit, challenge, and kick them around a bit until they can understand what best, or discover rather, what they're meant to be writing about and what they're best at writing, and how maybe most important of all, how to develop the skills and discipline of sticking with something. Everybody in the world could write a first draft of some story, but how many people are willing to go back and rework it so that it's not just telling your story to yourself, but somehow tailoring it so that it will be an experience for the reader that you want the reader to have.
But writing can be a kind of a cruel and almost abusive business to the writer, all that rejection, all of the impossible hurdles there. Do you ever feel like you're setting people up for a fall?
Well, I would if I didn't make sure they understood the possibilities.
My guest today is Jack Hodgins. We're going to take a short break and be back in a minute.
If you'd like more information about this program or any of the courses we offer at a distance, call us or visit our website. We welcome your comments.
Hi, you're watching Off the Page. My guest today has been Jack Hodgins. Well, we're talking about creativity right now. Jack, percentages here, inspiration versus perspiration?
Well, I think somebody famous said it. Now, what did they say? 90% and 10%.
What's your personal take on it?
I think it's more like 75-25.
75 perspiration.
Yeah, you have to have, well, I don't know if perspiration is the correct term. You have to work very hard in order to coax the inspiration to the surface. I believe in inspiration as the result of a lot of groundwork.
Jack, thanks for coming to Halifax and being on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for watching. I'm Leslie Choice. I'll see you again next time.